we're gonna change the macaroni and cheese to cheese macaroni.
Look at these two leading spaghetti sauces.
It's one fish as kids love. It's Betty Ben's for me.
Remember those grocery items, the plain, cheap ones you only grabbed when money was tight? In the 1980s, these shelves weren't filled with choices. They were filled with necessities that got stretched to feed a family. Looking back now, why do some of them still feel like home? Government cheese was not just a food, it was an era. It came in big blocks, the kind you could barely cut through without a decent knife and a little elbow grease. The box was plain, the color was wrong, and the flavor was somewhere between cheddar and candle wax, but it filled your sandwich. It showed up on grilled cheese, macaroni, baked potatoes, and anything else that needed to stretch. And if your family had a brick of it in the fridge, you knew money was tight, but you also knew you were going to eat. It was thick, it was salty, and it melted into this strange, velvety lava that somehow made everything taste better. You didn't buy it at the store, you got it from the government, and everyone knew it. Some families tried to hide it. Others made jokes. But everybody understood it meant survival. You learned to slice it thin so it would last longer, and no one dared waste even a sliver. It was hard to cut and harder to admit, but it kept a lot of people from going hungry. In a weird way, it became part of your identity. You didn't talk about it much, but you remembered. And years later, the taste still brings back something quiet and honest. Government cheese did not make you feel rich, but it did remind you that help, however humble, sometimes came wrapped in cardboard. Powdered milk was never about taste. It was about making sure your cereal had something to float in. The box sat in the back of the pantry like a backup plan, full of white powder you had to mix with cold water and pray it didn't clump. And no matter how well you stirred, it always tasted off. But it was there when real milk ran out. When your parents had to stretch that last grocery run an extra few days, sometimes it clumped into little chewy bits no matter how long you stirred. You would close your eyes and drink fast, pretending it was the real thing. It turned Cocoa Puffs into something closer to chocolate chalk. If you got the ratio wrong, it tasted like water with a grudge. But nobody threw it out. You learned to power through it. It taught you that food did not have to be perfect to be useful. You stopped asking for brand name milk and started accepting what was in front of you. And slowly, you stopped noticing the difference as much. It was the kind of thing you used quietly, hoping your friends did not notice. It had this chalky texture and an aftertaste that stayed with you longer than it should. You did not pour a big glass to drink. You used just enough to get by. The box lasted forever, which was both a blessing and a curse. Sometimes your parents would mix it half and half with real milk to make it stretch. And somehow, you still tasted the difference. It was survival in a scoop. And even now, just hearing the words brings you back to a time when you had to make do. You did not crave powdered milk. But when things got tight, you were grateful it was there. Off-brand cereal in the giant bag was how you ate breakfast without going broke. It came in plastic sacks the size of a sleeping bag, and it always sat on the bottom shelf of the cereal aisle, because that is where the cheap stuff lived. No cartoon mascots, no prizes inside, just flakes or puffs or little rings with names like Toasty O's or Honey Nuggets. And if you were a kid, you learned quickly not to compare it to the real thing. It was all sugar and crunch until the milk hit, then it turned to mush in under a minute. You stirred fast, trying to catch the crispy part before it vanished. The marshmallows, if there were any, felt like little erasers pretending to be candy. But it still had that sweet smell when you opened the bag, and that was enough. Your mom would pour it into a big plastic container to make it look official. You knew the truth, but you played along. You learned to love it because it meant there was still something to eat before school. And sometimes, it really did taste good, especially when you were too tired to care. It got soggy faster, the sugar was uneven, and the marshmallows were few and far between. But when your parents poured it into a Tupperware container, it suddenly became just cereal. You ate it anyway, because it was sweet enough and it meant breakfast was handled for the week. That bag could last forever, longer if your siblings did not sneak extra bowls after school. You learned to crush the clumps and shake the dust to the bottom, And even if it never tasted like the stuff on television, it got the job done. You did not feel poor eating it. You felt like part of a family that knew how to stretch a dollar. Off-brand cereal was not something you bragged about, but it was something you depended on. And sometimes it even tasted better because it came with a little pride. Macaroni and cheese in a box was dinner when money and time were both running low. It came with that tiny packet of powdered cheese, bright orange, slightly suspicious, and completely magical when mixed with butter and milk. If you had no milk, you just added more water. No butter? You stirred faster and hoped for the best. It came together fast, which was part of the magic. You could hear the noodles bubbling and know dinner was only minutes away. Some nights, your mom threw in canned tuna or a splash of evaporated milk. Other times, it was just noodles and hope. The powder never fully dissolved, and you learned to accept little orange clumps. It stained your spoon, your plate, and sometimes your shirt, but never your memory. You fought over seconds, even when it was the third night in a row. And you never forgot the box that made dinner possible when nothing else would. It was a science experiment in a pot, and somehow it always worked. The noodles boiled fast, and the whole box could feed a few hungry kids. Barely. It stuck to the spoon, stuck to your ribs, and stuck in your memory. Some people added hot dogs, others added peas, some just ate it straight out of the pan. You did not complain. It was warm, it was cheap, it was yours. And on nights when there was nothing else, it felt like enough. Boxed macaroni and cheese did not taste like comfort food. It was comfort food. Ramen noodles were the closest thing to a full meal for 20 cents. You bought them by the brick, and they stacked up in the pantry like edible building blocks. Boil water, drop it in, stir in the packet, and in 3 minutes, you had soup. Sort of. Sometimes the packet tore wrong and seasoning spilled all over the counter, but you scraped it up anyway. You knew every flavor by heart: chicken, beef, shrimp, and had your favorites ranked. If you were lucky, you had a slice of American cheese to throw on top. If not, you cracked in an egg and watched it swirl like magic. You ate it out of the pot, from a chipped bowl, or sometimes even from a coffee mug. You slurped, you burned your tongue, and you went back for another bite. It was the kind of meal that tasted better because you made it yourself. And no matter how old you got, it always reminded you of getting by. The broth was salty enough to wake the dead. The noodles were soft, cheap, and weirdly satisfying. You could dress it up with an egg, some vegetables, or just eat it straight out of the pot. Some kids crunched it up dry and ate it like chips. It was the ultimate survival food. College students and broke families alike swore by it. You did not eat ramen because it was trendy. You ate it because it was there. And when the cupboards were bare, it felt like a small victory. Hot, quick, and good enough to get you through the night. Ramen was more than a meal. It was a way to stretch a dollar without stretching your dignity. Canned Vienna sausages were the strange little lifeboats of the pantry. You opened the top with that metallic pop and stared down at the pale, slippery links floating in salty water. They smelled like dog food, looked a little off, and still, they got eaten. Because when you are hungry, you do not argue with weird. They were soft, salty, and easy to mash onto crackers or bread. You might slice them thin and call it lunch, or just eat them one by one from the can. If you fried them in a little margarine, they crisped up and tasted almost like real meat. They did not need to be refrigerated, which made them feel almost futuristic. You could eat them hot, cold, or lukewarm. Nobody was picky. You knew they were weird, but they were yours. Some people fried them. Others just ate them cold. You did not ask questions. You just chewed. It was protein in a can, and that meant something. They were cheap, they lasted forever, and they took up almost no space in the cabinet. You might wrinkle your nose now, but back then you were grateful. Every pantry had at least one dusty can in the back, just in case. Vienna sausages were not pretty, but they were always ready. Generic peanut butter was dense, oily, and impossible to stir without a fight. The label just said peanut butter, usually in big, blocky letters. No cartoon bear, no swirl of honey. Just a jar of brown paste that separated into two distinct layers the second you opened it. The oil floated on top, the sludge stuck on the bottom, and you needed a fork and serious wrist strength to get it moving. It was gritty and thick, and it tore your bread if you tried to spread too fast. The first few bites always stuck to the roof of your mouth, and if the oil ran out before the jar did, you were left with peanut cement. It was best on saltines, where you could ignore how dry it really was. Sometimes you added jelly, just to help it go down easier. And when you got to the bottom of the jar, it felt like you won something. But it filled you up, and it was cheap. It went on crackers, on toast, in sandwiches, and sometimes straight on a spoon. You learned to work with it, because you had to. If the label said extra smooth, you laughed, because it lied. Still, it was a pantry staple, there through thick and thin, literally. And when you were hungry, that hard-earned spoonful tasted like gold. Generic peanut butter did not win awards, but it never let you down. Instant mashed potatoes were like magic, if magic came in a box and tasted like wallpaper paste unless you got the ratios just right. You tore open the pouch, boiled some water, and stirred like your life depended on it. Add too much water and it turned to soup. Too little and it turned to clay. But if you nailed it, you got something warm, filling, and surprisingly comforting. It looked nothing like real mashed potatoes, but you said it did anyway. A little butter helped. So did salt if you had some left. You could fluff it with a fork and pretend it came from scratch, and if you were lucky, there was canned gravy to pour on top. No one asked for seconds, but no one said no either. You did not eat them for flavor. You ate them to fill space on the plate. They were a side dish, a base for gravy, or a bed for canned meat. They cost next to nothing, and they lasted forever on a shelf. And on nights when all you had was a box and a pot, they felt like a real meal. They made dinner look finished, even when it really was not. Instant mashed potatoes were the food version of fake it till you make it. Canned ravioli or spaghetti was what you ate when no one wanted to cook, but everyone still needed to eat. You popped the lid, dumped it in a pot, and stirred until it bubbled. No seasoning, no draining, no chopping, just heat and eat. The noodles were mushy. The sauce was too sweet. The meat was questionable. You could eat it straight from the pot, standing over the stove. Some people mixed in hot dogs or cheese to bulk it up. The can always looked smaller than it needed to be, but it was enough. It was the meal you could make without asking for help. And when it was cold outside, a warm bowl of canned pasta felt like a small victory. But it was warm. And it was easy. You could stretch one can across two bowls if you had to. And if you were lucky, there was still bread to wipe the bowl clean. Some kids loved it. Some just tolerated it. But everyone knew what it meant. You were tired or broke or both, and that can was dinner. It was a backup plan that got used way more than anyone admitted. Canned pasta was not fancy, but it fed you fast. And some nights, that was enough. Store-brand white bread was a soft, pale rectangle of filler that held the rest of your meal together. It came in a flimsy plastic bag with a twist tie that always disappeared the second you opened it. It tore easy, squished even easier, and turned into a doughy mess if you looked at it wrong. But it made sandwiches. It held peanut butter, bologna, or just a slice of cheese. If it got stale, you toasted it. If it molded, you cut around it. Sometimes you rolled it into balls and ate it plain, just for fun. It stuck to the roof of your mouth if you used too much peanut butter. If you toasted it too long, it turned into a cracker. But fresh or stale, soft or burnt, it still filled your stomach. It might not have tasted like much, but it did its job. You did not waste it. You worked with it. The crusts were dry, the slices uneven, but it was bread, and bread meant possibility. Sometimes it was breakfast, sometimes dinner, sometimes both. It did not matter that it was generic. It mattered that it was there, and for a lot of families, it always was. Store-brand bread was not a treat, but it was a foundation, and it kept a lot of plates from feeling empty. Day-old bread from the discount bin was how you got through the week without breaking the bank. It sat in a big wire rack shoved into the back of the store near the milk or the freezer section. bags marked down, smushed and stamped with a red sticker that screamed, "Today or never." You picked through the stack hoping for something soft enough to survive a few more lunches. Sometimes you got lucky and found a name brand. Other times, you took what you could get. White, wheat, hot dog buns, it did not matter. It all cost half as much and fed just the same. You could buy 3 loaves for the price of 1 and freeze 2 like you were planning ahead. The crusts were sometimes dry, but you trimmed them off and kept moving. French toast, stuffing, croutons, you found creative ways to use every last slice. Even the heels got their moment, usually pressed flat in a grilled cheese. It was not about freshness, it was about function. Your mom would freeze some to make it last, then toast the slices back to life. You could taste the dryness, sure, but you got used to it. With enough peanut butter, jelly, or soup to dip it in, it worked fine. Nobody bragged about eating it, but nobody turned it down either. It was not glamorous, but it was dependable. And when money was tight, day-old bread was still fresh enough to matter. You learned that value does not always come from a soft crust or a sell-by date. Sometimes it comes from knowing how to stretch what you have. Hot dogs in bulk packs were the easiest way to feed everyone without spending more than a few bucks. You could get 10, sometimes 12, for just a couple of dollars, and they came wrapped in plastic so thin it felt like you could tear it just by looking. They were not all beef. Sometimes they were barely meat, but they were food. Boiled, fried, grilled. If you had a stove, you had a plan. Kids would eat them with ketchup, adults with mustard, and some just straight out of the pot. You sliced them into mac and cheese and called it dinner. You cooked them on a fork over the stove burner like you were camping indoors. They made the house smell like lunch no matter what time it was. They were quick to make and quick to disappear. And if the pack ripped in the fridge, you still used them anyway. They showed up in beans, sliced over instant mac and cheese, or tucked into a slice of store-brand bread. You knew they were not great, but they were quick, salty, and filling. And when there were leftovers, they sat in a little plastic container, waiting to be reheated. Bulk hot dogs were not a delicacy. They were a utility. And in a house where the grocery list was always longer than the budget, they were a lifeline. Hot dogs in bulk kept the fridge from looking too empty. And for that, they earned their spot. Tuna in oil was not glamorous, but it got the job done. The can hissed when you opened it, the smell hit fast, and the texture was somewhere between firm and suspicious, but you ate it anyway. It was cheap protein and it came ready to use. Mixed with mayonnaise, piled on crackers, or dumped into noodles, it stretched far. Some people drained the oil, some stirred it in. Either way, you made it work. It was the kind of smell that lingered in the kitchen, but not in a bad way. You could eat it warm, cold, or room temperature, depending on how desperate you were. When lunch money ran out, tuna salad became the backup plan. You never needed a recipe, just a fork and whatever was in the fridge, and somehow it always tasted better the next day. It was salty, fishy, and weirdly rich, but it filled you up. Tuna salad sandwiches were a whole week's worth of lunches. You just had to ignore how oily your fingers felt after opening the can. There was no name brand snobbery. Whatever was on sale went in the cart. You ate it because you needed to, and sometimes because you kind of liked it. Tuna in oil might not have been the most appetizing thing in the pantry, but it was always there when you needed something fast and filling. Kool-Aid packets were pure sugar and survival. They cost pennies and promised a whole pitcher of something bright and vaguely fruity. You dumped the powder into a plastic jug, added water, and stirred like your life depended on it. If you had sugar, you added it. If not, you drank it anyway. The flavor didn't matter. It was cold, colorful, and yours. Red, purple, green. You called it by the color, not the name. There was always a stain on the countertop from the last batch. And if your cup was clear, your drink looked like a science experiment. Sometimes, if you were lucky, your parents let you mix 2 flavors just to see what happened. It never tasted like real fruit, but it tasted like summer. It was the cheapest way to feel like you were getting a treat. It stained everything it touched, and your tongue was proof. Some moms stretched it thin. Others made it strong, like liquid candy. Whatever the mix, It showed up at every cookout, every sleepover, and every broke summer afternoon. It was not fancy, but it felt like a treat. Kool-Aid was more than a drink, it was childhood in a cup. Cream of mushroom soup was not just a soup, it was an ingredient. It came in a tiny can, thick and beige, with chunks you tried not to think about. You added it to casseroles, mixed it with rice, poured it over chicken, anything to stretch a meal. It had one job: make plain food feel like something more. It was salty, gloopy, and strangely comforting. Even if you hated mushrooms, you still ate it. Some people thinned it out with milk, others dumped it in straight. It looked questionable in the pot, but came out of the oven like magic. You scraped the dish clean because there was never quite enough. That can was the base of a dozen meals and half your childhood. And every pantry had at least one hiding in the back, just in case. Because this was not about taste, it was about making things go farther. It turned leftovers into dinners and empty pans into something that looked finished. Your mom probably had a dozen recipes with it, all of them created out of necessity. And somehow it always made the meal feel like it had more to it. Cream of mushroom soup was not about flavor. It was about survival with a little warmth on top. Frozen fish sticks were rectangle-shaped hope in a box. You'd line them up on a cookie sheet and bake until the edges got crispy, if you had the oven on long enough. The breading was more dependable than the fish inside, but with ketchup or tartar sauce, they tasted good enough. They were cheap, fast, and easy to portion. 3 for you, 4 if it was Friday and you were lucky. They came out hot, golden, and smelling like the school cafeteria. Even if you burned the bottoms or undercooked the middle, they were edible. And when paired with some instant potatoes or canned corn, it felt like a complete meal. They made weeknights simple. That counted for a lot. Frozen fish sticks were never about taste. They were about making dinner appear like you had options. Frozen mixed vegetables in a brick were the colorless cornerstone of many meals. They came in a solid block, vacuum-sealed into plastic that had seen better days. Carrots, peas, corn, green beans, all stuck together in a frosty lump. You had to slam it on the counter just to break it up. Boil it, butter it, serve it beside meat that needed help. No one was excited, but no one complained either. They added something healthy to the plate, or at least colorful. Even if the texture was weird and the carrots always too soft. It was better than nothing, and that was enough. And when you stirred them into soup or casserole, you barely noticed them at all. Frozen veggie bricks were not exciting, but they checked a box and made a meal feel just a bit more balanced. Pinto beans by the pound were a pantry essential if you were watching every dollar. You bought them dry, scooped into a bag from the bulk bin, and brought them home with a plan. Soak them overnight, rinse them well, and boil them for what felt like forever. But once they were soft, they could feed you for days. You mashed them, seasoned them, and served them with rice or cornbread. They were warm, cheap, and surprisingly satisfying. They were not fast, but they were dependable. They taught you patience and how to stretch a pot. You did not need meat, you needed beans. And when seasoned right, they tasted like comfort and resourcefulness all at once. Pinto beans were not exciting, but they were enough. And sometimes, they were exactly what you needed. Evaporated milk was shelf-stable security. The can lived in the cabinet like a silent backup plan for when fresh milk ran out or was just too expensive. It was thick, slightly sweet, and poured slow. Some people thinned it with water, others used it straight. You used it in coffee, in baking, or to stretch boxed mac and cheese. It added creaminess where there was none. It was not glamorous, but it was useful. You could open a can and finish dinner without panic. That meant a lot in a house where things could run out fast. It was like having a little bit of just in case tucked on the shelf. Evaporated milk was a small comfort in a big can. Store-brand American cheese singles were plastic-wrapped persistence. Each slice peeled from a stack like a sticky bookmark, and no matter how hard you tried, the corners always stuck together. The color was a little too orange. The texture? Unclear. But it melted like a dream. Grilled cheese, cheeseburgers, scrambled eggs, it made everything feel more complete. one slice could turn basic into better. It tore easy, stuck to your fingers, and sometimes felt more like packaging than food. But it was cheese, and that meant flavor, fat, and a little joy. You never had to slice it, shred it, or guess what it cost. It was cheap, consistent, and always waiting in the fridge. Store-brand singles were not quality, but they were comfort, one foldable piece at a time. Jiffy Corn Muffin Mix was the kind of thing that showed up when you needed just a little more on the plate. It came in a small blue and yellow box with instructions so short you could memorize them. Just add an egg and some milk, stir, and bake. The batter always looked too thick, and the powder puffed out in clouds if you moved too fast. But once it was in the oven, the smell alone made dinner feel more real. It baked fast. You could burn the bottoms if you weren't careful, but that smell, that slightly sweet, buttery scent, meant things were coming together. Even if dinner was beans or hot dogs or leftover chili, a warm corn muffin next to it made the whole thing feel more thought out. The crust would get golden, the inside fluffy and just a little crumbly, and you always knew which piece was yours by how lopsided you poured the batter. Some people added cheese or chopped jalapenos. Others just served it plain, with a pat of margarine that immediately melted. If you had nothing else, you could just eat one or two of those muffins and still feel full. They were small, but they were powerful in that way, cheap food that made you feel taken care of. You could make 6 or stretch it to 12 with a little extra milk. That box didn't just stretch a recipe, it stretched the feeling of abundance. You always had a box of Jiffy tucked somewhere in the cabinet, ready to step up and do its part. And somehow, it never let you down. Canned green beans were the vegetable that showed up on your plate whether you liked them or not. They came in a dented metal can, sometimes with a faded label, always in that dull shade of green that let you know these beans had been through something. You opened the lid, poured off a little water, and dumped them straight into a pot. They did not snap, they did not crunch. But they were vegetables, and vegetables were important. You might toss in a spoon of margarine, maybe a pinch of salt if you had it, or, if it was a fancy night, a bit of crumbled bacon. They were soft, salty, and slightly metallic, and somehow comforting. They filled up the side of a plate when you needed something green but had no budget for fresh produce. They lasted forever on the shelf, which made them one of the few things you could always count on being there. You could eat them plain, stir them into casseroles, or serve them with instant potatoes and call it dinner. No one was ever thrilled to see them, but no one was surprised either. And when you were hungry enough, they hit the spot. Canned green beans were not fancy, but they were always honest. They showed up when it counted, and in a home that counted pennies, that meant everything. Margarine in a tub was a fridge fixture, reliable, affordable, and often mistaken for butter until it hit your tongue. It lived next to the milk and the jelly in a tub that got reused for leftovers and mystery soups. It spread easier than butter, melted fast, and always seemed to last longer than it should. You scraped the corners even when it was down to a film, because that last bit still counted. It went on toast, in boxed mac and cheese, brushed over cheap dinner rolls, or mixed into instant mashed potatoes. You used it to grease pans when you were out of oil and swirled it into vegetables when they looked a little too plain. It was yellowish, a little salty, and sometimes you wondered what it really was, but it did its job. If it got warm, it turned glossy and soft. If it got too cold, it tore the bread. But it was there, and it was yours. When recipes said butter, you knew they meant margarine, and if anyone asked, you said it tasted just as good. Maybe it did. Or maybe you were just grateful to have something at all to soften a hard day. Margarine in a tub was not about flavor. It was about making everything stretch a little further and taste a little more like home. Off-brand soda in 2-liter bottles was the loud, fizzy thrill you could afford. It sat on the bottom shelf with names like Cola Pop, Mountain Thunder, or Dr. Lightning, and it came in colors too bright to occur naturally. You never cared that it wasn't brand name. You cracked it open at cookouts, poured it into plastic cups at birthday parties, and watched it go flat in the fridge after 3 days. But you drank it anyway. It was sticky, syrupy, and sweet enough to make your teeth ache. Some flavors were hits, others were a gamble. But when your mom came home with 2 liters for under $1, you knew you had something to look forward to. It went with popcorn on movie night and washed down peanut butter sandwiches better than milk. You learned not to shake it, not to trust the fizz too much, and not to let your siblings pour first. You did not have soda every day, so when you did, it mattered. And even if it left a weird aftertaste, it always tasted like a treat. Off-brand soda was never about being the best. It was about being enough, bubbly, cheap, and ready to turn an ordinary day into something a little more special. Canned fruit cocktail was dessert when dessert was not in the budget. It came in heavy syrup with soft chunks of something that might have been pears, maybe peaches, and those neon red cherries that only showed up 1 per can. You fished for the cherry first. Everyone did. The rest was eaten in scoops, cold from the fridge or straight from the can with a spoon that always felt too big. The juice was sweet enough to pass for syrup, and on a good day you poured it over a slice of cheap cake or a scoop of store-brand ice cream. It was never glamorous, but it felt fancy if you put it in a glass bowl. There was no crunch, no bite, just soft sweetness and the feeling that you were having something special. Some nights it was served after dinner. Other times it was dinner. It lasted forever on the shelf, and you always had a few cans waiting, just in case. And even if it was just fruit that had traveled too far and sat too long, it still tasted like care. Canned fruit cocktail was what you had when life gave you limits. And somehow, with all its syrupy sweetness, it made those limits feel just a little more generous. Powdered milk was never a treat. It was a chore. You mixed it in a plastic pitcher, hoping the lumps would disappear. They never did. It smelled like chalk and tasted like a dare. If you drank it warm, forget it. That was a punishment, not a beverage. But it got poured into cereal, added to mashed potatoes, and stirred into baking mixes like it belonged. Because it had to. Milk was expensive. Powdered milk came in giant paper envelopes and lasted forever. Not because you loved it, but because it was always there. You stirred it with a spoon until your wrist hurt. Then you stirred it more. Your mom would say, "Let it sit, it tastes better cold." And somehow, she was right, kind of. It was used to stretch the real milk when you were lucky enough to have some. Half and half was not a fancy coffee blend. It was how you survived a dry week. Powdered milk showed up in food pantry boxes, in school kitchens, in battered community centers. It was dependable, it was disliked, and it was necessary. Today, it is mostly used for baking. But if you were poor in the 1970s, you drank it straight, and you learned to stop complaining. Canned beets or carrots were not anyone's favorite, but they made the plate look complete. You opened the can, drained the liquid, and served them straight, or maybe warmed them in a little butter. They were soft, too soft sometimes, but you ate them anyway, because in the 1970s, getting vegetables meant buying what you could afford, not what looked best. They added color, nutrition, and just enough balance to a meal made of starch and meat. You did not love them, but you learned to work with them. You mashed them into other dishes when the kids refused to touch them. You glazed them with sugar and crossed your fingers they would pass for something better. Some cans were tastier than others, depending on the brand and the batch. The smell when you opened them was never great, but it faded fast. You knew they were overcooked, but at least they were cooked. They rounded out a meal that might otherwise be missing something green or orange. A little sugar for the beets, a little brown sugar for the carrots. They weren't perfect, but they were enough. Canned vegetables filled the gap between what you wanted and what you had, and they did it quietly. Now let us cool things down a little and talk about Swenson's. Just saying the name might make you crave something sweet. Swenson's was not just an ice cream shop, it was an event. Bright colors, vintage vibes, and menus that looked more like storybooks than food listings. Every Sunday had a name, and every name came with a little magic. It was the place you went after Little League games, family dinners, or just because it was Tuesday and you wanted a treat. Swenson's had that old-fashioned charm, but never felt out of date. Maybe it was the way the whipped cream swirled just right, or the cherry perched perfectly on top. But whatever it was, it worked. Banana splits, hot fudge sundaes, ice cream sodas. They were not trying to be healthy. They were trying to be happy. And it showed. Each visit felt like a reward. A place where kids could feel like royalty for a few minutes, and adults could remember what it felt like to just enjoy dessert without guilt or green juice. And you better believe the staff leaned into the theme. Uniforms, big smiles, the whole 9 yards. It was not fast food. It was ice cream theater. Every scoop was a little show and everyone left smiling. There are fewer Swensons around today, but their memory is still scooped into our minds. They were more than a sweet stop. They were a reason to leave the house. In a time when entertainment did not come from a screen in your pocket, Swenson's gave you a reason to look up, order something colorful, and just enjoy the moment. The community swap meet in the church parking lot was a patchwork quilt of folding tables, lawn chairs, and a whole lot of neighborhood hustle. It was always held early, way too early, and Dad would pull up with a thermos of coffee and a plan. This was not a place for big spenders. This was a battlefield of bartering. He would go straight to the tables stacked with transistor radios, old tools, and that mysterious plastic bin full of tangled cords that might be useful someday. You were eyeing the table with the mismatched action figures and board games missing all the pieces. There was always one guy who sold nothing but velvet Elvis paintings. No one ever saw him set up or pack up. He was just there. The swap meet had its regulars. The Tupperware lady with 1,000 lids and no matching containers, the comic guy who only sold back issues from 1974, and the woman with jars of jelly that looked more suspicious than sweet. But Dad? He moved through it all like a seasoned pro, chatting with everyone like they were old buddies, walking away with something bizarre like a mini fan or a set of ceramic pigs, and when he said, "Let's stop by the junkyard real quick," you knew things were about to get even stranger. Esprit was not just fashion. It was a feeling. Youthful, bright, alive. The brand captured a moment when clothes were not just about style, but about saying something. About the world, about identity, about freedom. In the 1970s and 1980s, Esprit exploded across America. Their catalogs were works of art. Their stores were full of color and energy. It felt like the future. You walked into Esprit and felt like the main character in your own story. It was clothes for the bold, not just the fashionable. But fashion moves fast. By the 1990s, trends were changing. Grunge came in, minimalism followed, and Esprit's cheerful aesthetic felt out of place. Management changed. Expansion overreached. And what once felt vibrant, now felt dated. Sales dipped. Stores closed. By the early 2000s, Esprit in the United States was nearly extinct. It survived in Europe and Asia for a while longer, but the magic had faded. For a certain generation, Esprit was the brand they wore to school dances, to mall hangouts, to first dates. It was more than fabric. It was memory, stitched into every sleeve. Now it is a whisper from a closet that no longer opens. W.T. Grant was not just a department store. It was a part of the American landscape. In the 1970s, it had over 1,000 locations. Main streets, suburban malls, strip centers. W.T. Grant was everywhere. It sold clothes, appliances, hardware, school supplies. You could buy a pair of jeans, a toaster, and a lawn chair in one trip. But behind the counters, trouble brewed. Management wanted growth, and they wanted it fast. Stores were built too quickly. Debt piled up, and worst of all, they handed out credit like candy. Their revolving charge account let customers buy now, pay later, with no real system to check if they could afford it. The trust they gave customers was generous, but fatally blind. W.T. Grant did not just run out of money, it ran out of time. The losses mounted. In 1976, W.T. Grant filed for bankruptcy. It was one of the largest retail collapses in American history. Thousands of workers lost jobs, communities lost familiar storefronts, and shoppers lost a place that felt like home. Unlike other stores that faded quietly, Grant's collapse was loud, public, and painful. It was a warning shot across the bow of American retail, grow too fast, trust too much, and the walls will fall. People still remember the logo, the way the floors creaked, the smell of new shoes in a cardboard box. But the store itself is gone. Kool-Aid packets were magic if you had sugar. For 5 cents, you got a tiny envelope of dust and dreams. Cherry, grape, orange, lemonade. It did not matter. You dumped it in a pitcher, added water, and stirred with a giant spoon. Then came the sugar. A full cup, maybe 2. Or, if money was tight, half a cup and a prayer. The weaker it was, the more it burned going down. But it was still cold, still bright, still yours. You drank it from jelly jars, poured it into ice cube trays, called it punch, and served it at birthday parties. It stained your clothes, your lips, your countertop, and you still loved it. It was summer in a plastic pitcher, and it lasted for days. You could stretch one packet across a whole week, especially if nobody noticed it got thinner by the glass. And when you had friends over, it felt like serving a special drink, even if it was mostly tinted water. Kool-Aid was never fancy, but in a kitchen without soda or juice, it felt like a treat. And in a house on a budget, a 5-cent flavor went a long way. Plain yellow mustard was the flavor that kept on giving. It cost almost nothing, lasted forever, and made even the driest sandwich feel like it had something going for it. You slathered it on white bread with lunch meat or just a slice of cheese. Sometimes just mustard and bread was the whole sandwich. It was sharp, tangy, and completely unmistakable. It made hot dogs feel complete, perked up meatloaf, and gave leftovers a second chance. The jar or squeeze bottle sat in the fridge door like an old friend, always there, always useful. You never needed much, just a little bit to cut through the bland. It lit up potato salad, deviled eggs, and even the crust of a grilled cheese. You never ran out completely. There was always some hiding in the back. You could stretch it through summer barbecues and winter sandwiches alike. Even when you were out of almost everything, you usually had mustard. It stained your fingers, your clothes, and sometimes your plastic plates, but you forgave it. Its tang made you feel like you were eating something bold, even when the rest was basic. And no one ever judged you for leaning on it, because they did too. It might not have been fancy, but mustard pulled more weight in a 1970s kitchen than people gave it credit for. It was cheap, bright, and honest. And sometimes, that was exactly what dinner needed. You could spot the big boy statue from the parking lot, that grinning kid holding up a cheeseburger like it was the crown jewel of America. And in the 1970s, he really was. Big boy restaurants were warm, welcoming, and wrapped in that all-important family vibe. Cozy booths, laminated menus, and milkshakes that showed up tall and frosty. This was classic diner comfort. Big Boy served everything. Seriously, everything. Burgers, meatloaf, pancakes, fried fish, pie, spaghetti. It was the Swiss Army knife of chain dining. No matter who you came with, a picky kid, a meat and potatoes dad, or a grandma who just wanted soup, everyone found something they liked. But the star was the Big Boy combo. A double-decker cheeseburger with that signature sauce that somehow tasted exactly the same in every state. And that was the magic. No matter where you were, a Big Boy meal felt familiar. The restaurants themselves felt like home away from home. Staff who remembered your name, booths you sank into, and that little paper placemat you always ended up doodling on while you waited. It was not fancy, but it was ours. And let us not forget the desserts. Hot fudge cake, banana splits, pies that came in rotating displays. They always had something sweet waiting at the end. Big Boy was not trying to reinvent the wheel. It just made sure everyone in the car left full and happy. In a time before foodie culture and Instagram menus, Big Boy reminded people that a good meal did not have to be complicated. Just warm, filling, and shared with the ones you love. The strip mall pet store did not smell like adventure. It smelled like wood shavings and fish food. But when Dad said, "Let's stop in for a minute," you knew it meant 20. The walls were lined with glass tanks full of turtles, frogs, and fish that looked too bright to be real. You would press your nose against the glass and point. "That one. I want that one." Dad would shake his head and smile. "We're not getting a turtle." 5 minutes later, you were holding a goldfish in a plastic bag, trying not to spill it on the seat of the car. He was not a pushover. He just knew the power of a memory. And that pet store, as humble as it was, felt like a mini zoo to you. There was always one sleepy lizard under a heat lamp and a parrot that squawked like a broken doorbell. Sometimes you would hear, "Hey there," from across the room and realize the bird was mocking you. Dad would strike up a conversation with the guy behind the counter like they were old war buddies, swapping advice on filters and food pellets. You would head home with a tank, a packet of food, and a new responsibility you were not quite ready for. And when you were ready for something outdoorsy, Dad knew just the place, with canoes and no life jackets in sight. There was a time when TWA meant elegance, a time when stepping onto a Trans-World Airlines flight was like entering a luxury hotel in the sky. The seats were wide, the service crisp, the logo iconic. From movie stars to newlyweds, everyone wanted to fly TWA. It was part of the golden age of air travel. But by the 1970s, the clouds were darkening. Deregulation hit hard. New competitors raced into the skies, offering faster routes and cheaper fares. Fuel prices soared, labor disputes dragged on, and TWA's once glorious reputation began to buckle. What once felt like flying with royalty now felt outdated and expensive. Suddenly, the airline of tomorrow had become yesterday's news. It expanded too quickly, bought too many jets, and could not keep up with the ruthless economics of modern air travel. Bankruptcy became a familiar word. By the time American Airlines absorbed what remained in the early 2000s, the brand was already a shadow. Airports removed the signs, crews traded uniforms, but the memory lingered. For anyone who flew TWA during its heyday, there was nothing like it. Now, it is a name buried under decades of debt and nostalgia, a ghost with wings. Spray fixative for art containing benzene gave every elementary art class that weird industrial edge. If you ever made a charcoal sketch or pastel masterpiece, chances are someone gave it a glossy finish with a fixative spray that doubled as a mini chemical hazard. The stuff smelled strong, like sharp varnish and nail polish remover had a baby, and teachers would often wave their hands around it saying, "Don't breathe too much of this in." But in rooms with no ventilation, that was easier said than done. Benzene was the key ingredient in many of those sprays, prized for its quick drying power and ability to seal artwork without smudging. But what wasn't advertised on the can? Benzene is highly flammable, causes bone marrow suppression, and has been definitively linked to leukemia. Art classes were basically low-grade hazmat zones. Eventually, safer alternatives were developed, and benzene was restricted or banned from most consumer products. Still, the damage lingered. For many kids, the smell of creativity was also the smell of chemical exposure. And while we're on the topic of childhood routines, let's talk about the daily boiling ritual that now sounds downright medieval. There was a time when S&H green stamps were as good as cash. You collected them with every grocery run, every gas station stop, every purchase that counted. And then you filled the little books. Carefully, patiently, with the pride of someone building something out of nothing. Families traded them in for toasters, radios, even bicycles. It felt like free rewards for loyalty. A quiet handshake between shopper and store. The moment you tore out a full book and handed it over felt like winning something without spending a dime. For many working-class families, it was the only kind of bonus life ever handed out. But loyalty changed. By the late 1970s, inflation had twisted prices beyond recognition, and stamps felt like yesterday's trick. Credit cards came in, bringing points and cashback offers. Big box stores offered everyday low prices instead of incentives. And suddenly, people did not want to save pages of stamps anymore. They wanted savings now. S&H tried to pivot, offering catalogs, electronics, even vacations. But it was too late. The books sat half-filled in kitchen drawers, forgotten. The redemption centers closed. The stamp became a relic. And with it, the ritual faded. Ask someone who grew up with S&H, and they will smile at the memory. But they will also tell you when it ended, it felt like losing part of what made everyday shopping feel like a game worth playing. Off-brand cereal in a bag was not cool, but it was affordable. No cartoon mascots, no box, no toy surprise, just a giant plastic sack of crunchy shapes that looked almost, but not quite, like the name brand. Fruity Circles instead of Fruit Loops, Corn Crunch instead of Corn Pops, Marshmallow Magic instead of Lucky Charms, and every flavor was a little off. You poured it into a bowl with powdered milk and called it breakfast. It got soggy fast. It stuck to your teeth. But you still ate 2 bowls and called it a good morning. Moms bought it because it lasted a week and cost less than a movie ticket. You ate it because it was sweet, kind of. It came in huge bags that barely fit in the pantry. You clipped it shut with a clothespin and prayed for freshness. The marshmallows crumbled, the flakes broke, but it fed the whole house and nobody dared waste it. In the 1970s, off-brand cereal was not shameful. It was smart. And if you were lucky, it even came in chocolate. Boxed cornflakes, store brand of course, were breakfast on a budget. They came in plain boxes with boring fonts and nothing inside but the flakes and maybe some cereal dust. They were crunchy for the first 30 seconds, then turned soggy if you were too slow. You poured sugar on them if you could. Otherwise, you powered through. They were not exciting, but they were consistent. You ate them dry, you crushed them into meatloaf, and you used them as filler when the good cereal ran out. No mascots, no games on the back of the box, just cereal that did what it needed to do. You reused the box for school projects, wrapping paper, or organizing drawers. The bag inside was always noisy and impossible to open cleanly. You knew the bottom half would be mostly crumbs, but you kept going. They sat high on the pantry shelf because no one ever snuck them for a midnight snack. They were bland, honest, and there for you when sweeter cereals vanished too fast. Sometimes you mixed them with another cereal just to give them a second chance. No one asked for them, but no one threw them away. Cornflakes taught you that reliable food is underrated. They were plain, honest food in a world that demanded you stretch every dollar. Boxed cornflakes did not make you feel rich, but they did make sure you were fed. You know the place. Wood paneling on every wall, carpet so sticky it felt like your shoes might stay behind without you. The local bowling alley was not fancy. It was not even clean. But it was ours. That neon open sign buzzing in the window like it had not taken a break since 1963, that was the beacon. Dad would hand you a pair of shoes that smelled like defeat and victory all at once, then lace up his own with the confidence of a man who once bowled a turkey in '68. Scoreboards flashed with those pixelated animations, and the jukebox in the corner had a permanent skip in track 6. The cheese fries came in paper boats, scalding hot and gooey enough to glue your soul together. You would keep score with a tiny pencil, and Dad would act like the math was rocket science. For some reason, that made it better. There was always one ball he swore by, the dusty maroon one with a chipped thumb hole that he said gave him more spin. It never did, but he let you try it anyway. And after every frame, win, or gutter, he high-fived like it was the championship. But if you really want to see Dad in his element, wait until you hear about the dented can grocery run. Datsun was everywhere in the 1970s. Sleek, reliable, affordable. The kind of car your neighbor drove, your cousin saved up for, and your dad secretly liked better than his American sedan. It was Japan's Trojan horse into the United States market, and it worked brilliantly. But success brought identity problems. Nissan, its parent company, wanted global consistency. They did not want to be Datsun in one country and Nissan in another. So in the early 1980s, the decision was made: rebrand. Slowly, Datsun vanished. The name was pulled from brochures, badges, and showrooms. And just like that, a brand that millions had trusted was gone. People were confused. Dealerships had to explain that Nissan and Datsun were the same. Some buyers walked away. The transition was rocky, and for a while, Nissan lost ground in the market it had fought so hard to win. Looking back, the choice makes sense. But it still feels like something was stolen. A name, a memory, a piece of the road. Banned food dies like red dye. Number 2 were once sprinkled into everything fun. Sodas, candies, breakfast cereals, even maraschino cherries. If it was bright and artificial, Red dye number 2 probably had something to do with it. The shade was electric, almost glowing, and it turned even the most boring snack into a psychedelic experience. But behind the rainbow hues was a harsh reality. Studies in the 1970s linked the dye to tumor growth in lab animals, and although the evidence was debated, it was enough to cause widespread concern. In 1976, the FDA pulled the plug, banning the dye in food products across the United States. Suddenly, pink snacks vanished, red candy went dull, and cherry pie filling looked suspiciously beige. It was the end of an era for neon food. Since then, more artificial dyes have come under scrutiny, leading to stricter regulations and a push for natural alternatives. But back then, if your cereal didn't leave a red ring in the milk, was it even worth eating? Still, food wasn't the only thing that turned out to be a little too potent, because some baby powders did more than just soothe. Before it made video game history, Coleco was just trying to survive. The Connecticut Leather Company, yes, that is what Coleco stood for, started with shoes and evolved into above-ground pools, plastic toys, and electronic gadgets. In the 1970s, it was everywhere, but it was never dominant, always chasing trends. Then came the video game boom. ColecoVision arrived and gave the company its first real taste of national success. The graphics were better, the games felt fresh. For a brief moment in the early 1980s, Coleco looked unstoppable. It felt like they had finally found their niche, a lane where they could lead instead of follow. But success came faster than the company could stabilize, but it did not last. The video game crash of 1983 hit like a hammer. Coleco overextended, banking on a market that evaporated almost overnight. It tried to pivot again, launching the Cabbage Patch Kids dolls, which sold in the millions. But lightning rarely strikes twice. Manufacturing problems, patent lawsuits, financial strain. By the end of the decade, Coleco was bankrupt, sold off, dismantled, and the dreams of a plastic empire turned to dust. For anyone who grew up in that era, Coleco was part of the magic, part of the joy, part of the fall. Canned ravioli or spaghetti was childhood comfort and poverty on a plate. Chef Boyardee was not just a man. He was a lifeline. Open the can, dump it in a pot or microwave-safe bowl, and boom, instant meal. The sauce was sweet, the noodles were soft, and the meat? Suspicious. But you did not care. You slurped ravioli like it was gourmet and spooned spaghetti like it came from an Italian grandmother. If you were lucky, you had bread to wipe the bowl. If you were not, you just licked it clean. It was warm. It was filling. And it made you feel like dinner was handled, even when the cupboards were bare. You could eat it out of the pot, the can, or a chipped bowl with a cracked spoon. It made school lunch jealous. It made cold days feel manageable. And when it was the only thing in the cabinet, it was a blessing. The can hissed when you opened it. And that sound meant dinner was happening. It was not nutrition. It was not fancy. But it was food. And when you were on food stamps, this was a pantry staple. 2 cans for $1 meant you could feed all the kids and still have enough for lunch the next day. Chef Boyardee was not about flavor. He was about filling the gap, and he did it well. Canned tomato paste was not something you ate on its own, but it was in everything. You added a spoonful to soup, to sauce, to anything that needed depth on a budget. It was thick, dark, and so concentrated it stained your fingertips. 1 little can could stretch a meal for 6. You learned to scrape every last bit from the corners with a spoon. It was the base of spaghetti night, chili, casseroles, even homemade ketchup. When fresh tomatoes were too expensive, tomato paste stepped in without complaint. You mixed it with a bit of sugar to cut the bitterness. Sometimes you watered it down and pretended it was marinara. You knew it was a shortcut, but it never felt like cheating. A can of tomato paste gave dinner a backbone, even when the ingredients were bare. It lived in the back of the cupboard, waiting quietly for its turn. No one ever praised it, but nothing tasted right without it. In the 1970s, that tiny can held more than just flavor. It held possibility. Tomato paste was how you made cheap food taste like you tried. There was no intention to buy anything, and everyone knew it. The furniture store with the free popcorn machine was Dad's idea of a Saturday outing. You would walk in and get hit with that smell: leather, fresh carpet, and hot butter. Dad would head straight for the recliners, and you? Straight to the red and silver popcorn machine near the back. It was always humming, full of those little white bags that were supposed to be single serve, but somehow you found a way to go back 5 times without getting caught. Meanwhile, Dad was doing his test sit. That meant stretching, sighing, and rocking the recliner back and forth like he was making a real decision. "Too stiff," he would say. "This one's a back killer." The sales guy always came over and Dad would nod along, arms crossed, like he was closing in on the deal of the century. But you knew he was not buying a couch. He just liked the idea of picking one. And that popcorn? It was better than movie theater popcorn because it was earned. All this to say, shopping never felt like shopping with Dad. It felt like a game. But speaking of buttons, lights, and games, let me tell you about the kind of place where Dad's inner nerd really came to life. If any of these brought back a taste, a smell, or just a feeling you forgot you remembered, share your story in the comments. Tap like if it hit home, and subscribe so we can keep setting the table together.